The bank manager slid the foreclosure notice across the kitchen table, and 11-year-old Wren Calloway picked it up before her father could stop her. She read the number at the bottom twice, folded the paper in half, and walked out to the barn without saying a word. Nobody in that kitchen knew that by the end of the summer, the girl who'd just read her family's debt out loud would be the one paying part of it down. With money nobody thought she could raise, from a business nobody thought she could run. The Calloway place sat on 94 acres outside Lindsborg, Kansas, land that had been in the family since Wren's great-grandfather broke the sod there in 1931. Wheat mostly, some cattle in the back pasture, a windbreak of cedars her grandmother had planted as saplings. It wasn't a big operation. It had never needed to be big to keep a family fed and a mortgage current. Wren's father, Dale, had taken over the farm 8 years earlier when his own father's heart gave out during harvest. He knew wheat. He knew cattle. What he didn't know, not really, was how to run numbers against 3 straight years of drought and a diesel bill that climbed faster than the price of grain. Wren had grown up watching him do math on the back of feed receipts at the kitchen table, the same table where the bank notice now sat. She was the middle of 3 kids, quiet in the way that made adults assume she wasn't paying attention. She was paying attention. She'd been counting eggs since she was 6, helping her grandmother can tomatoes since she could reach the stove, and she had a habit, one her mother found endearing and her older brother found strange, of saving every dollar she earned in a Folgers can she kept under her bed. Babysitting money. Money for finding a neighbor's lost dog. Birthday money from an aunt in Salina. Wren wasn't the kind of kid who talked about her plans before she'd already started them. Her 4th-grade teacher had once written on a report card that she was a careful observer, slow to speak, quick to act. A line her mother kept taped inside a kitchen cabinet because it seemed to explain her daughter better than anything the family had come up with on their own. She didn't ask permission for things she'd already decided to do. She just did them and let the adults catch up when they noticed. That spring, after the notice came, Wren counted what was in the can. $42. She didn't tell anyone what she planned to do with it. She just started doing it. The back corner of the property, past the cedar windbreak, was a quarter-acre nobody used. Too rocky for wheat, too far from the house to bother fencing for cattle. Her grandfather had once kept a garden there. It had gone to Johnson grass years ago. Wren borrowed a hoe, borrowed her brother's wheelbarrow without asking, and started clearing it herself, 3 hours a day, before the Kansas heat made the work unbearable. Dale found her out there on a Saturday morning, sweat-soaked, blistered, turning over ground that hadn't seen a tool in a decade. He asked what she thought she was doing. Starting a farm, she told him. He laughed. Not unkindly. Dale wasn't a man who laughed at his children to hurt them, but he laughed the way a tired adult laughs at a child's plan that doesn't match the size of the problem. The bank wanted $41,000 by October or the note would be called. He had a wheat crop that wasn't going to cover it, a line of credit at Continental Farm Bank that was already stretched thin, and a daughter telling him she was going to help with $42 and a quarter-acre of reclaimed weeds. "That's real sweet, Wren," he said, and went back inside to call the bank about an extension. Her mother was gentler about it but no more convinced. Her brother, 16 and already helping with the cattle, told her flat out that she was wasting her summer on something that wouldn't move the needle. Even her best friend from church, when Wren mentioned she was going to sell eggs and vegetables at the Saturday market in town, asked her, not unkindly, just honestly, how many eggs she thought it would take to save a farm. Nobody told her to stop. Nobody thought they needed to. A quarter-acre and $42 wasn't a threat to anyone's judgment. It was just a kid's project, the kind of thing you let a child do because it kept her busy and out of the house. There was a particular conversation that stuck with Wren more than any of the others. Her uncle, visiting for a Sunday dinner in late May, asked her straight out what she thought $42 would buy on a farm. She told him seed and feed for a start. He nodded the way adults nod when they've already stopped listening, and said something about how it was good she was learning the value of hard work, even if the arithmetic wouldn't add up to much. He meant it as encouragement. It didn't land that way. That was the mistake. Not cruelty, just the ordinary, forgivable mistake of grown people too tired and too worried to look closely at what an 11-year-old was actually building. Dale went back to his phone calls. Her mother went back to the checkbook. And out past the cedar windbreak, the Johnson grass kept coming up out of ground that hadn't been touched in 10 years, one hoe stroke at a time. Wren spent her $42 in a single trip to the farm store in McPherson. A bag of seed potatoes, 3 packets of bean and squash seed, and a started flat of tomato plants a clerk sold her at half price because they were leggy and unsold. She used $9 of it on chicken feed, because she'd already talked her grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Petrick, into giving her 4 hens too old to lay well for a commercial operation but plenty good for a girl's first flock. She didn't tell anyone her plan beyond that. She just worked. Every sale she made, every dozen eggs, every bundle of green beans, every basket of tomatoes she carried in a red wagon to the Saturday farmers market in Lindsborg. She recorded on the back of a receipt and dropped the receipt into an old cigar box her grandfather had left in the barn. She didn't use a notebook. She'd tried once and lost it in the rain. The cigar box stayed dry, stayed in one place, and by July it was thick with folded paper. The first discovery came in early June, when she realized the eggs sold faster than the vegetables. People in town would pay $1 more per dozen for eggs from hens they could see grazing in an actual yard, not stacked in cages. She raised her egg price by 50 cents and nobody blinked. The second came a few weeks later, when a woman at the market asked if Wren took special orders. She wanted a full bushel of tomatoes for canning, more than Wren's plants could give her that week. Wren said yes before she'd thought it through, then spent 2 nights coaxing every green tomato on the vine to ripen faster under a south-facing window, and delivered 51 pounds on a Thursday for cash the woman had ready in an envelope. The third discovery was quieter and mattered more. Mrs. Petrick, watching Wren work the coop one afternoon, mentioned almost offhand that she still had her late husband's old egg route. A list 30 years out of date of restaurants and diners across 3 counties that used to buy eggs by the case before the big distributors took over. Most of those places were gone. A few weren't. Wren copied 6 names off that list onto the inside lid of the cigar box. The fourth discovery happened by accident, the way most real ones do. A man from a diner in Salina, one of the 6 names on Mrs. Petrick's old list, stopped at the Lindsborg market looking for something else entirely and noticed Wren's eggs. Brown, uniform, cleaner than what his current supplier sent. He asked for her number. She gave him her father's, since she didn't have one, and told him she could do 6 dozen a week if he wanted. By the end of July, the cigar box held $683 in folded receipts. Wren had told no one the total. She had told no one about the diner in Salina. She was, by any measure a grown person would recognize, running a small business. Nobody in her family had noticed because nobody had thought to ask. She'd also started keeping the flock's feed costs separate from her sales, the way she'd seen her father track fuel against wheat prices, even though nobody had taught her to do it that way. It cost her about $14 a week to keep 4 hens laying and, by midsummer, a fifth she'd bought off Mrs. Petrick for $6. She didn't think of it as bookkeeping. She thought of it as making sure the chickens didn't eat more than they earned. It amounted to the same thing. The market itself had its own rhythm she learned by watching rather than being taught. The first hour after the market opened at 7, the serious cooks came through, the ones canning for winter or feeding a big family, and they bought in bulk and didn't haggle. By 9, the crowd thinned to browsers who wanted a dozen eggs and some conversation. Wren figured out fast that showing up at 6:30 to set her table before the crowd, with her eggs stacked in neat rows and her tomatoes wiped clean of dust, mattered more than anything she said to a customer once they were standing in front of her table. August brought the kind of pressure that has nothing to do with a child's garden and everything to do with grain markets and interest rates. Dale's wheat came in lighter than he'd hoped. A dry June had cost him almost 8 bushels an acre, and the number the bank wanted by October didn't shrink. If anything, with the extension fees Continental Farm Bank tacked on, it grew. Dale started making calls he didn't want to make, to his brother-in-law about a short-term loan, to a neighboring farmer about renting out the back pasture, to the bank itself about restructuring terms he already knew were bad. He wasn't a man given to despair, but there were nights that August when Wren heard him and her mother talking low in the kitchen after the younger kids were in bed, and the tone in her father's voice was one she hadn't heard from him before. The loan officer at Continental, a man named Russ Ferber who wasn't unkind but was busy. He had 11 other farms in similar trouble on his desk that same month. Told Dale plainly that without a meaningful payment by the deadline, the note would be called and the family would need to talk about what parts of the land could be sold to satisfy it. He said it the way a man says something he's said 100 times that year. Not cruel. Just tired of saying it. Wren kept working the quarter-acre. Her hens were laying well into fall. Her second planting of beans came in strong. The diner in Salina had upped its order to 8 dozen eggs a week, and a second restaurant from Mrs. Petrick's old list, a lunch counter in Marquette, had started buying vegetables by the crate whenever she had extra. She was up past midnight some nights sorting eggs by porch light, and up again at 5 to feed the flock before school. Her brother noticed the wagon trips into town were getting more frequent. Her mother noticed the cigar box had gotten too heavy to sit flat on the shelf. Neither of them asked to look inside it. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes from being scared about a big number. It makes people stop seeing the small ones stacking up right in front of them. There was one evening in early September when Dale almost found out early. He was hunting for a stamp in the junk drawer by the back door and pulled out an old cigar box by mistake, thinking it might hold what he needed. He shook it once, heard the thick rustle of paper inside, assumed it was some collection of wrens, pressed flowers, maybe, or church bulletins, and set it back on the shelf without opening it. Wren, watching from the hallway, didn't say anything. She just waited until he'd gone back to his own pile of bills before she moved the box somewhere safer, out to the barn, tucked behind a coffee can of old nails. The hens kept laying. The second planting of beans came in heavier than the first. And every Saturday, rain or shine, the red wagon made its trip down the gravel drive to the highway and into town, a little fuller each week than the week before. 2 weeks before the bank's deadline, Wren counted the box for the first time since June. She sat on the floor of the barn and laid every receipt out in rows, the way she'd seen her father do with feed bills, and added them by hand because there was no calculator in the barn and she didn't think to go get one. $1,940. She sat with that number for a long time before she folded the receipts back into the box. 3 days before the deadline, Dale sat at the kitchen table with the last of his numbers spread in front of him, still short by a margin that made his jaw tight. Wren set the cigar box down next to his coffee cup without a word. He opened it thinking it was something of hers she wanted him to see, a school project, maybe. Then he saw the receipts. Egg tallies in a child's handwriting. A crate order from a lunch counter in Marquette. A diner ticket from Salina for 8 dozen a week, signed and dated going back to July. "How much is in here?" he asked, not really believing there was a real answer. $1,940, she said. "I kept $60 back for feed next month." Dale had projected the family would need to find close to $9,000 to satisfy Continental's short-term demand and avoid a forced sale of the back pasture. Wren's contribution wasn't the whole amount, nowhere close, but paired with the sale of 11 head of cattle Dale had been putting off and a smaller emergency loan from his brother-in-law, it was enough. Enough to make the October payment. Enough to keep Russ Ferber from having to make the call he'd been dreading having to make to a family he actually liked. Nobody in that kitchen said anything for a moment. Dale just sat there with a cigar box of a child's receipts in his hands, and the silence in the room said more than any speech could have, that he understood, finally and completely, what he'd let himself dismiss back in May as sweet. Word got around Lindsborg the way it does in a small town. Not through Wren, who never told the story herself, but through Mrs. Petrick, who couldn't help but mention at church what the Callaway girl had done with a rusted-out garden patch and a bag of half-priced tomato plants. People at the Saturday market started asking for her by name. The diner in Salina put in a standing order through winter. Eggs the hens could still manage even in the cold. Dale kept the quarter-acre fenced properly that fall, the first real investment the farm had made in it since Wren's grandfather planted his own garden there decades before. He didn't say much about it directly. He just started calling it Wren's ground instead of the back corner, and left it at that. If you've ever watched someone underestimate a person because of their age or their size or the number in their bank account, and then watched that person prove them wrong anyway, you know exactly why stories like this one matter. Hit subscribe because there are more of them coming. That October, after the note was paid, Wren went back out to the quarter-acre with a bag of garlic cloves to plant for next spring. The kind of crop that takes 8 months to come up, planted by someone with no reason to doubt she'd still be there in June to dig it out. She didn't plant it because she'd proven anything. She planted it because that patch of ground had work still to do, and so did she.